What does feminism have to do with prison abolition and Palestine? Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. This video will be covering chapters 1 and 2 in Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle. If you haven't gotten a chance yet, I recommend you go back and check out the intro lecture that I did, which gives you a little bit of context for how to read this book, but you can also just jump in right here. The structure that I have for this series is a video every 2 chapters. So today we're covering chapters 1 and 2. Next week we're covering 3 and 4, and so on until we hit chapter 10. Now the structure is a little bit different for this series, and it's just because there is a little bit of repetition throughout this book. So this is a collection of speeches and interviews with Angela Davis. It's got a little bit of a different vibe to it from the books that we normally cover. And so for that reason, I'll be pushing a couple things off into different videos that I'll be making through the course of this. Specifically, prisons, the prison industrial complex, we will talk about next week when we tackle chapters 3 and 4. And another thing that will form a big part of these first 2 chapters, but will be pushed to week 3, is the idea of progress. How do we measure progress, and what does it mean when we invite certain people in to join the system? And can that really be considered progress? That will be addressed later on. But so if you're watching this video and you're wondering, why are you not talking about G4S, for example, it's because we're going to talk more about that next week. Now, quick roadmap for this video. We're talking about 4 things today. We're talking about intersectionality, we're talking about the carceral mentality, we are talking about electoral politics, and we are talking about violence. So 4 things that we're going to cover in various degrees today. And again, if you don't see something, you can definitely mention it, but chances are it will be brought up a little bit later. And as a quick reminder, just before we get into it properly, please like, subscribe, tell your friends about this, and do check out the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. You can go and see previous books that I've done on this. You can see a film series that we're doing. You can also check out the 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers series, which is where I come on and talk about the 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers. We're in the proto-anarchist phase right now, so we're talking all about the early precursors to anarchist thought. You can find all of that over on the Patreon. Again, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. And if you are already a subscriber, thank you so much for being here. Your support means the world. But let's jump right into it and let's talk about intersectionality. And I sort of teased this a little bit in the intro video, so this is something that I already talked a little bit about, but let's recap it just to have it all here. So to recap real quick, intersectionality comes to us mostly from feminist theory. And people like Angela Davis are really at the forefront of it, although the term itself is officially coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw. Although before Crenshaw, there is a long history of theorists and ideas that lead up to what will eventually be called intersectionality. And there are even people who make the argument that people like Sojourner Truth in her very famous Ain't I a Woman speech, that's all the way back in the 1850s when she's talking about this. And she makes in this speech the argument that Black people, the enslaved and the formerly enslaved, are being excluded from notions of femininity. And so this is a very intersectional argument. So even people like Sojourner Truth are considered sort of early intersectional thinkers. But there are a number of theorists that come to give us this idea of intersectionality, and they've come to prominence, particular prominence, during what's generally called the third wave of feminism. If you're not already familiar with this, there is a rough and sometimes ridiculous system of designation of different waves of feminism. So you have the first wave feminism, which is kind of late 19th century into the early 20th century, which is all about suffrage and the right of women to vote. You have the second wave of feminism, which is more about civil rights. This takes place in the 1960s. It kind of looks at social inequality, things like that. And then you have the third wave of feminism, which is where you start to get the early intersectional theorists and questions of diversity start to come up in the third wave. And then there are people who typically describe the fourth wave of feminism starting in the 2010s, roughly. And that is all about a full embrace of intersectional arguments, more about diversity, more about the objectification objectification of women, more about sexual violence, certainly. So there are a lot of thinkers, but if you ask me, a lot of these designations are kind of meaningless, because if you read any feminist theorist, their work cuts across these waves in such a clear way that it almost becomes a little bit ridiculous to talk about it in these terms. However, they can sometimes be helpful. But listen, Sojourner Truth was making intersectional arguments back in the 1850s. So, fair enough. Now, some of the most recognizable names in intersectional theory are people like Angela Davis, people like Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and all of these people are making the argument that we're going to lay out here. Now, before we get into that, I want you to ask yourself one question, which is, what do you think of when you think of the term intersectionality? A lot of people will jump to the idea of privilege, which is absolutely part of this intersectional argument. And it has to do with this idea that certain people, depending on their position in this overall matrix of privilege, will have more privilege, more access, more space, more clout, whatever it is, that gives them a bit of a leg up in society at large. Now, privilege is absolutely part of the intersectional argument, but it's not all there is. Other people may jump to notions of class, of gender, of race, queerness as well. All of this kind of comes into the logic of intersectionality. These are kind of the main categories that we typically hit. And unfortunately, a lot of people think about these in terms of kind of a checklist sort of thing. This is not anywhere near that idea. However, there are people, especially online, who will frame this as a question of checklists, as this person is queer and black and female, and so therefore they must be more oppressed than this other person. This is not really a mathematical exercise. All of these things absolutely come into notions of intersectionality. However, it's not in any sense like that. Intersectionality really goes far beyond. It's not about a checklist. It's not about saying one person is more oppressed than another. It is, in a very real sense, anti-categorical. Intersectionality is about the system that, to varying degrees, oppresses all of us. And it is fundamentally a recognition that we are all engaged in a shared struggle. Davis says, for example, we are still faced with the challenge of understanding the complex ways race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, and ability are intertwined, but also how we move beyond these categories to understand the interrelationships of ideas and processes that seem to be separate and unrelated. We will get into this notion of category when we ask the question later on in this series, what is the category female? What does that mean? And how do you build in notions of queerness? Angela Davis is very, very clear on this point, but we will come to that later. For now, we actually have to talk first about Palestine. And again, we will talk much more about Palestine. Don't worry, it is all over this book. However, when we think about Israel and Palestine right now, the absolute domination of an entire group of people, the genocide, the forced removal, the mass starvation, all of this, when we think about that, that is, from an intersectional lens, something that we deeply need to care about, regardless of the struggle that we are engaged in. When we also consider that this is a US-backed genocide and that it happens and is perpetuated with the tacit or willing participation of basically most of the Western world, using weapons from manufacturers that are based predominantly in the US and the UK. When we think about all of this, anyone who claims to care about feminism or the queer struggle or decolonization or the global South or prison abolition or defunding the police, any of this, anyone who claims to care about those struggles but doesn't speak about Palestine is engaged in willful ignorance, and it is despicable. This is something that Angela Davis says very, very clearly, and we should sort of honor this argument that she makes in this book. By the way, way back in 2014. And of course, the occupation and ethnic cleansing of Palestine is something that has been going on for a very, very long time. So 2014 is actually late, if anything. But this is something that Angela Davis has argued throughout her entire life. And in 2014, she is incredibly clear. This is pre any information that we had about the genocide, about mass starvation, about any of that. And back in 2014, she is making this argument, and she is making it very clearly. Because the line right after the quote that I read earlier is this. She says, insisting on the connections between struggles against racism in the US and struggles against the Israeli repression of Palestinians is, in this sense, a feminist process. And this is the thing about intersectionality. You cannot turn a blind eye to any struggle because they are all interrelated. We are all fighting against one system, this system of capitalist domination that sort of underpins absolutely everything. And Angela Davis recognizes that. And so you cannot fight a queer struggle without including trans people. You cannot fight a prison abolitionist struggle without including the struggle of the Palestinians against Israel. You can't fight your struggle without recognizing that these issues underpin essentially everything that we do, the way that we live our everyday lives. All of this is connected. And so that's all to say, as we leave this intersectional section, you cannot leave any group out in the cold. And as you are fighting these battles, and we all go and fight these battles, as you do that, you have to remember that this is part of the larger story. And by the way, just on a personal note, that's one of the things that I love the most about this book is that Angela Davis has been fighting for a very, very long time. She was on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. She was part of the Black Panther Party. She was an American communist for a long, long time. She was excluded from teaching positions because of that. She has all of this grounding in all of this, and she could go out very clearly and talk about the struggle of Black Americans, or she could go out and make her feminist argument, but she chooses instead absolutely to discuss all of those things, but to also at any given point talk about the struggle of the Palestinians against Israeli genocide, and that is very clear, and to her very great credit, she is not losing sight of the argument that she herself is making, that these are all fundamentally connected struggles. Anyway, enough ranting about that. Let's talk about the carceral mentality. Now, we should say something about this, and I need to bring this up here because I know we are going to talk about prisons next week. I said this already. However, we really do need to talk a little bit about the idea of the carceral mentality because it goes so well with the intersectional ideas. And it's a very key idea that Davis drops on us. And it is summed up in this one line that she gives us, which is, we internalize this notion of a place to put bad people. What does that mean? Well, it may mean a few things. We've actually referred to a set of very similar ideas throughout the books that we've talked about on this channel. We talk actually very frequently about the ways that we have ourselves internalized capitalist ideologies, and this is a very similar notion, and it comes from Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault is somebody we talked about last time when we talked about Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, an early, well, an influential prison theorist, if not terribly early, let's say. And so Davis draws on the ideas of Michel Foucault to make the point that prison has always been a process of reform. She and Foucault point out, in fact, that the very birth of the prison was a process of reform. We talked about this in the intro video as well. So prison was supposed to be a humane way to replace the things that came before it, which were very public and very brutal punishments. And so prison was supposed to be reformist from the very beginning. And so the entire process of prisons that brings us to the modern carceral state is a process of push and pull between the notion of reform and the notion of sort of law and order punishment. And Davis adds, and this is pretty crucial, that prison isn't just a place. It's not a physical location where you put people. Of course, it is a physical location where you put people, but it's also an ideological place. It's a psychic place. And this is why I compare it with ideas that we've discussed before, the ideas that we have internalized the notions of hierarchy or racism or sexism or whatever it is. Davis is here to tell us that we have also similarly internalized the carceral mentality. Putting somebody in prison because they are bad prevents us from asking the real questions, the difficult questions. Questions like, why are they bad? Why did they do this bad thing? Why are we punishing them? And does it actually work that we punish them? The conversation becomes instead about what to do with bad people. So people are just bad, right? You have to do something with them. And so you put them in a prison. So the conversation becomes, where do we put the bad people? And maybe how can we make life slightly better for them? And Davis rejects that conversation completely. Well, not completely. And we will come to the notions that she talks about later, this idea that we can fight for better conditions while seeking to abolish something. We'll refer to that a couple times actually through this series. But for now, we are precluding the question of, do we need the prison? Where does badness come from? And Davis, of course, makes the argument that the violence that put these people, supposedly bad people, in prison is perpetuated and magnified by the prison complex. And of course, all of that is done for profit, which is something we're going to talk about extensively next week as well. But for now, just keep in your mind this idea, these questions of, when it comes to crime and punishment, do we need the prison, and to what extent have we internalized and been force-fed the idea that we do need the prison? Now, we should say a few words about electoral politics, and it's a short section in the first chapter, but I think it bears mentioning because, in the final section of our videos, we will talk about, or the final two chapters, I should say, I will say something about the things that we are fighting for and the process of fighting for fundamentally seeming contradictory ideas. So the example that Davis uses is, we should fight for the rights of queer people in the military, even as we seek to dismantle the Pentagon. And I think that is a perfect idea, encapsulation, a summation of what we're going for here. However, in this chapter, she talks about something that might come as a bit of a surprise, which is using the electoral system to further our ends. Let's clarify exactly what she means here. Davis says that using the existing political parties should not be our main way of fighting against the system. However, electoral politics can be very useful in terms of organizing. Davis says, of course, you need a third-party alternative to come into the electoral system. We need to work on that. But she says throughout all of this, the real radical action comes from the grassroots. It comes from people on the ground actually organizing things, and electoral politics can be a very good way to do that. This may seem, especially if you come from an anarchist perspective like I do, it may seem like a tough thing to square, right? It takes a lot of work to work in a political campaign and for seemingly not very much reward, especially in the United States. And I'm sitting here in the UK right now. It feels like you do all this work on a political campaign and really nothing happens at all. And the question there is, shouldn't we focus instead on building alternative structures, things that we've talked about on this channel before, things based on mutual aid that are actually about creating something completely different from the existing setup of power and hierarchy, and focusing on our efforts and our energies on something that may actually work. Personally, I think, yes, we should direct most of our focus there. However, Davis says that we can do both, that we can fight battles in the electoral system, use them as an organizing methodology, and at the same time try to build these structures that are independent, something like the BPP, the Black Panther Party did in the 60s and 70s. So they were very active in setting up alternative structures, everything from free food and breakfasts to schooling and education. So Davis ultimately says, yes, you can fight both battles. I personally wonder to what extent that is true. However, she is undeniably right that you can do both things. And listen, there are wins. We shouldn't be too cynical about this. There are wins that can genuinely come from the electoral system, and there is progress that can be made that can make a real difference in people's lives. And so perhaps she is right that we should fight both battles. But that is a nearly impossible question that I will leave you with, because we also need to talk about violence. Now, the idea of violence comes to us from the interviewer, Frank Barra, who asks about a scene in the Black Power mixtape, which is a documentary film. And I've linked that on the Patreon if you are interested. In the film, Angela Davis is asked if she approves of violence. And she basically says, ask me if I approve of violence. This does not make any sense. And by the way, you can find that scene on YouTube. It is kind of instructive and kind of cool to see. But she elaborates here because he specifically asks her about this. She says the question really should have been directed to the people that have the monopoly on violence. So the police, the prisons, and the military specifically. She also talks about the institutional violence of just the United States and the system that exists as it is, as well as the completely allowed violence that the KKK perpetrated on Black communities for a very long time throughout US history. And that was done with the tacit consent of the authorities. And she's not wrong about any of this. In this section, she basically says, listen, revolutionary violence is not the type of violence that you should be worried about. The real violence, most actual violence, is done perfectly legally. Now, she does soften this a little bit because she says revolutionary transformation isn't primarily about violence. It is about building structures that can provide for the lives of people and make people's lives better. We know this to be true, right? And this is exactly what the Black Panthers were trying to do throughout their entire history. However, she doesn't walk back her statement of the approval of violence really at all. And to be honest, I don't think she needs to. But of course, all of this leads us to a few key questions that we need to be asking ourselves as we tackle these first two chapters. And these are questions like, how do you create a truly intersectional struggle? How do you build a movement around that? Also, how do we rid ourselves of the carceral mentality, which is a question that you could ask about many of the types of things that we ourselves have internalized just from living our normal lives. Another good question would be, is it possible to make progress through the electoral system? I know I said yes, but that's just my answer, and I would be curious to hear yours as well. And then, of course, the final question is, to what extent is violence justified in any of this? And is there an extent to which the violence becomes counterproductive? This is something that we talked about as well when we talked about the wretched of the earth. And it's something that Frantz Fanon makes a very clear point of saying, of course there is space for revolutionary violence, but you have to understand that it is a weapon, and weapons can have backlash. I will leave you with these absolutely impossible questions, and I will be back next week to talk about prisons and the system that we are all struggling with, the prison industrial complex. So I'll leave that for then. I will see you next time. Please don't forget to check out the Patreon channel. Again, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. Let me know what you think through any channel you like, and you can even reach out to me directly. People do that all the time, and I really appreciate it. I absolutely love to hear from people. So whatever you like, it makes me happy. Let me know, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.